Hello everyone, and welcome to the 7th plagiarized episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Leslie Headland from Disney Lucasfilm, an utterly insane, selfish filmmaker whose ignorance and arrogance pissed Star Wars fans off once again for the millionth time in a row. A franchise that requires unity across the fan base instead has people at each other's throats over this rotten pile of garbage she created, and today we will rip her apart. Now there's a very large elephant in the room, and I know you wouldn't let me hear the end of it if I didn't mention it. Leslie Headland has found herself in boiling water because of her close association with one Harvey Weinstein, a film producer who was exposed, arrested, and charged as a sex offender for advances on women that were not consensual whatsoever. A lot of the controversy around Leslie Headland in this regard is that given her close association with Weinstein, there could have been no way she had no idea what was going on. Leslie herself states that the furthest Weinstein went with her was verbal abuse, but nothing more than that. Now, as shitty as a showrunner Leslie Headland is, I am a firm believer of innocent until proven guilty. And the thing with Headland is that there's zero direct evidence connecting her with the crimes of Harvey Weinstein. However, I still think we should be suspicious of Headland despite that. I do think there's a chance Headland was negligent and let Weinstein assault other women, but we'll probably never know for sure, and that uncertainty prevents me from saying any more. So yeah, I'm bringing it up because people wouldn't let me hear the end of it if I didn't, but I want to stop the discussion there. And let us move on to the confirmed problems with Leslie Headland. You've probably heard this many times before, but Leslie Headland, like most Disney Star Wars showrunners, are heavily biased against the prequels and George Lucas. She, like many, believes George Lucas gets far too much credit for Star Wars, even though he built the foundation from the ground up, and basically believes what George made isn't sacred. The worst mentality for a so-called Star Wars fan to have, in other words. George Lucas is the god of Star Wars, and if you don't want to accept that, then you should not be making a Star Wars show. The point is, the most obvious problem with The Acolyte is this. It's meant to spite George Lucas. None of the showrunners will ever say something directly negative about George Lucas. They'll phrase their distaste for him like it's an obvious objective problem. But at the end of the day, no one like Leslie Headland enjoys Star Wars. In fact, they dislike what George made it into, so they'll actively work to undermine the story he created. The main way Leslie does this in The Acolyte is trying to paint the Jedi as problematic for the wrong reasons, and trying to paint the Sith as sympathetic, both of which prove she completely missed the point. Despite being someone who wants to make a show based on Knights of the Old Republic, she sure as hell hasn't played the games as much as any actual fan of those games have. KOTOR goes over the philosophy of both the Jedi and the Sith, with a representative character for both telling us, Master Zar and Yuthura Ban. Arguably, Headland doesn't understand who the Sith are more than she doesn't understand the Jedi, and doesn't understand the full extent of what the dark side is. The dark side is a trap that Force users get sucked into, and Sith do this to the most extreme degree. Being a Sith is about the individual, and only the individual. And that means being self-centered and selfish all the time. If you don't pursue empowering yourself by exploiting others, then you fail to be a proper Sith. The dark side actively harms life in the universe, and nothing good comes out of it. It consumes anything it touches. This is not a subjective viewpoint. It's how the dark side is always portrayed in George Lucas's work, and work of others who actually understand his universe. Presenting the Sith as sympathetic and having a point is something that completely misses the point of Star Wars. Leslie Headland, on top of that, is another one of those insincere showrunners who wants to portray themselves as a multiculturalist. In case you don't already know, Disney is full of superficial representation, and her touting The Acolyte out as the gayest, almost diverse Star Wars show is an attempt to look inclusive, but in the year 2024, having a multicultural cast is now more easy than it has been ever. I mean, it's confirmed that Leslie Headland was easily able to get Lee Jung-jae after seeing him in Squid Game, and all Lee required was a language coach for his first English language role. I mentioned in the Kathleen Kennedy video how shows like The Acolyte are actually an insult to shows like Star Trek that actually had to put the work in when it comes to diversity. Regardless of the fact that Leslie Headland is a lesbian, she was literally playing the card of, I'm not racist, I have plenty of black friends. And if she wanted to convince anyone that she actually cared, then she wouldn't have tried so hard to enforce it, and surround herself with people of different ethnicities. The Acolyte is as insincere as it gets when it comes to representation. And while not coming from the horse's mouth, it's clear that people she hires aren't even Star Wars fans at all, such as Charlie Barnett, the idiot actor who thought he was the first Black Jedi, even though Mace Windu beat him to it by 25 years. And going further back, Dace Dieth was a Black Jedi introduced in 1994 with the Tales of the Jedi comics, and he would have beaten Charlie Barnett to it by 30 years. And keep in mind that Tales of the Jedi was one of the first storylines that presented Jedi as numerous instead of scattered. Surrounding yourself with actors and actresses you only hired for diversity purposes and couldn't even be bothered to remember the movies on a basic level, you know your show, its actors, and the story you wrote are screwed. Disney showrunners in general have such a poor handling of cast and crew members who know nothing about the source material to what they're making. And it's not exclusive to Star Wars. An external example is the infamous Rachel Zegler. But back to Leslie Headland, she has built the Acolyte on a big misconception she had about Star Wars. She has commonly expressed in interviews that she knows little about Star Wars, and has a negative, backwards mindset towards what George Lucas made. She is someone George Lucas would have never hired, and he didn't. She was obviously hired by Kathleen Kennedy, the evil overlord who oversees Star Wars nowadays and is content with turning it into what she wants, rather than what George wanted like she promised. The story of the Acolyte is a poorly strung along mystery, built on misconceptions surrounding Star Wars. Leslie Headland, despite the criticism, still has no idea where the backlash comes from. And like most showrunners after J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson, she must have known that her style, shall we call it, would anger fans. But she did it anyways. You can't even argue that she truly believed in her story despite that, because it was meant to go against George Lucas's vision. If you're gonna deviate from the source material, you're entering essentially unknown territory. You're going to get complaints that you changed Star Wars to fit your ideas instead of George Lucas's ideas, no matter what you do. With all the negative stigma around Star Wars, the last thing you want to do is double down on what pisses people off. It's a vicious cycle of never learning a thing from past mistakes and continuing in the wrong direction. Honestly, the backlash is something Leslie Headland should have expected, and her response is indifference in continuing the hypocritical notion that fans are racist, sexist, or homophobic. A lack of introspection that's central to it. Nobody cares that Leslie Headland is a woman, and that she married a woman. Absolutely nobody cares whatsoever. And crying about how it's a problem does a disservice to other women like Leigh Brackett, who is posthumously given credit as a writer for The Empire Strikes Back. Because insisting that women have been excluded from Star Wars for a long time is blatantly untrue. But people like Leslie pretend they are the first, or they're an exception. In fact, Disney invalidated this illusion years ago, since it's been going on for years. Kathleen Kennedy and whoever she appoints are the ones in charge, and in fact, toxic white men or whoever who complain are powerless compared to them. So complaining about this shit is redundant and ungrateful. You're in a position above most people, and you think so-called toxic men are ruining your reputation in shows? You're paid literally millions of dollars to make content that isn't even any good. People like Leslie and Kathleen Kennedy are in actuality extremely self-centered for complaining about a male-dominated fan base, because that's never been the case. I will argue that Star Wars, at least previously, appealed to boys more, but that didn't mean girls couldn't join in. It's nothing more than a baseless conspiracy theory as ridiculous as the flat earth. but those like Leslie believe in it because it's a convenient narrative. No one with a high-ranking position at Disney Lucasfilm is a victim, because they're the ones steering the ship we all sail on. The reality is, The Acolyte is a high-budget, low-quality shitstorm created by a selfish showrunner who thinks having a racially diverse show in 2024 is anything to write home about, or like it's any sort of achievement. What she ended up giving was an underwhelming show, designed as a mystery for the sake of being a mystery, filled with superficial representation, poor writing, and everything in between. Leslie Headland, for a lack of better words, is one of the worst people you could call a Star Wars fan. Biased, pretentious, and ignorant. Leslie Headland is far from fit to call herself a showrunner. She has employed the same tactics others before her have implemented, and it's led to such contention against The Acolyte, because she can't follow the source material to save her life. She's got to change the story into something else, and that never demonstrates genuine love for the story. There are contradictory sources on how well The Acolyte is doing, and The Acolyte represents the general apathy there is towards Star Wars nowadays. And as Kreia said, apathy is worse than death, because at least a rotting corpse feeds the beasts and insects. Leslie Headland contributed to the same problem every other Star Wars show made by Disney Lucasfilm has. That all adds up to a terrible quality control ratio. Very rarely will we get something worth it from Disney Star Wars, and the times we'll get it rarely is when Disney keeps their prying eyes away from it. Leslie Headland is a garbage showrunner. On top of the skepticism she started off with, because of her association with a known sex offender, she couldn't even prove that she could do Star Wars justice. I imagine she wouldn't have been hired in the first place if she was actually a fan of Star Wars, as it's Kathleen Kennedy who's been hiring and keeping everyone in power. That doesn't excuse Leslie Headland for what she's done, however. If she wasn't a fan, she should have stayed far the fuck away from Star Wars. But the lure of fucking over the story was too enticing an offer, as at the end of the day, surface level thinkers will accept anything officially made as legitimate, and unfortunately for us, Leslie Headland chose evil. Thank you for listening to this episode of Analyzing Evil. What do you think of Leslie Butthead? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes?
Under the mountain, a golden fountain. Were you praying at the Larish shrine?